So today we have Michael Clarke, who's a returning speaker. So we're very happy to have Michael again. Thank you very much for your time. He was just talking about how he's been 10 years retired. I guess that's in quotes. But he is still, I guess it's an emeritus fellow of King's College, and he was former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute. I'm just going to hand over to Michael and try and get his slides up while he says hello. You might need to unmute yourself, Michael, because I muted you.
So I've unmuted myself, and I hope you can hear me now. Yeah, good. No, thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to speak to people in Hexham, as always. As Faith sort of said, I've been hanging around the bazaars of Whitehall and Westminster as a hanger-on for many years now, and certainly for the last 10 years since I've been formally retired. And it's a great antidote to that, to speak to a group like Hexham, because it keeps you grounded, and it reminds me of how strong our civic community is, of people who just want to understand and do things at a proper human level. And I think it's always interesting for me to interact with groups like yours. There's another group in Kiel that I spend a certain amount of time talking to. It's the same story. It's local people who are interested and prepared to turn up on a wet Tuesday night or whatever it is, or log in or watch something because they want to understand, they want to keep informing themselves, but they want to do things. They want to interact as a community, and I find that very interesting and useful. So thank you for the invitation. And this presentation, I've called it Decades That Happen in Days. I take it from the comment that Lenin made. He actually said decades that happen in weeks. It was between the February and November revolutions in 1917, before he was taken in a sealed train through Germany to grab the revolution that was happening sort of rather quietly in Russia in the early parts of 1917. But that's what he said, nothing happens for decades, then decades happen in weeks. And I just call it Decades That Happen in Days because it just makes for a better, more alliterative title. But undoubtedly, we are living through a period in where, in effect, decades are happening in days. And I mean, very, very briefly, and the days that I'm talking about are, February the 24th, 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was no way back for Russia. Because of that, there's no way back for the rest of us in Europe because of that. So we've got an ongoing war in Europe that we never thought we'd see again at this level. On the 7th of October, 2023, the Hamas atrocity in Israel, which created a widening regional war, and we see that literally every day. At the moment, that war gets wider and nastier and is remaking the Middle East before our eyes. Last year, we saw a series of coups and military governments in the Sahel, with a series of humanitarian crises across Africa, South Sudan and Sudan as well. And those crises, in a humanitarian sense, are now the worst in the world. We don't spend a lot of time reporting on them in our media, but we know objectively that they are the worst crises that are occurring in the world at the moment in terms of sheer extent and misery. And then on the 5th of November last year, Trump was elected in the United States, and everybody knew that that would initiate a series of disruptive changes in world politics. And so it had. I mean, immediately he started talking about Canada becoming a 51st state. He started talking about taking over Greenland, implicitly by force, if he couldn't buy it, by Panama, the same. And in saying that, whether he was joking or not, and I can promise you he wasn't joking, certainly not about Greenland, but in saying that, that was music to the ears of Moscow and Beijing, because he was talking the same imperial language that they talk, that the United States has a right to take over Greenland in some way, just as the Russians say they have a right to take over Ukraine and Moldova when it comes to it, and maybe northern Kazakhstan and maybe the Baltic states. And China has a right to take over Taiwan and the South China Sea, which they say really belongs to them. So you've got the United States immediately talking the same language as the two other big imperialist powers. And then here we are this year with tariffs and Taiwan and the Middle East wars, and increasingly a struggle for the soul of America. I mean, we don't know if democracy is really now at stake in the United States. Certainly the Trump administration is attacking traditional American democracy, and that fight is only just beginning. after 6 months of the Trump presidency, and it will undoubtedly go on for 4 years, but it might go on for a lot longer. It's entirely plausible that if Trump is regarded as successful in the United States, if the whole thing doesn't collapse under its own weight, then there will be another Trumpist candidate after him, who might do 8 years. So the Trumpist America may last for 12 years. And if it does, the America that will emerge from that will be, I would imagine, will be a very, very different America to the America we've known for the last century and a half. And so there is a struggle taking place now. We see it every day of the week now for the soul of America. There's no telling where that will go, but we know what it's doing internationally. So there's a series of days that I would call them days of days in which politically decades are happening. And I represent it a bit like this. It's the catastrophe wheel. Imagine a wheel on a spindle on a board, and imagine this slide does not come out terribly well. But imagine that there's a piece of elastic that's attached to the rim of the wheel at around about 11 o'clock, and it's attached at the other side, not to the wheel, but to the board in which it's on. So imagine that wheel is under a bit of tension with the elastic and a little bit of tweak to the right. Every time it tweaks to the right, the elastic takes it back again to where it was. And it can keep being tweaked a little bit to the right and the wheel will go back. But at some point, quite a small tweak, smaller than the others, might take it over the critical moment. And suddenly the wheel turns all the way around, or it turns a long way round. And that tends to be what happens to international systems. They survive shocks and things more or less go back to where they were. And another shock and things go back to more or less where they were. And then a relatively small shock, something smaller than all the others. And suddenly the wheel goes, 30, 40 degrees round or 180 degrees round. It's known as the catastrophe wheel. And things, when catastrophic things happen, they often happen very quickly. So let's think about this. Let's think about the first of the big issues. The first big issue is, what is it now about the Western allies? And there is Trump in the first term on the top left, arguing with all of his allies. There's Trump on the top right, arguing in the White House, that awful meeting on the 28th of February with Zelensky. And at that moment, it just looked as if the Americans had changed sides in the war in Ukraine. They decided that they wanted the Russians to win. They decided it was Ukraine's own fault for being invaded, that the victims should just give up. And it was the victims who were being unreasonable, while 20,000 of their children, a lot more than 20,000 actually, but 20,000 recorded names and identities of children had been kidnapped and taken into Russia. Well, the genocidal activities in Bucha, the war crimes and all the rest of it. It looks as if the Americans were not impressed by any of that, and they simply blamed Zelensky for what was going on. And then last week, the NATO summit, in which the NATO allies, as it were, couldn't do enough to flatter and praise Donald Trump. And even the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, called him Daddy. And there was a meme put out by the White House, say, Daddy's home. He loves that, absolutely loves it. Well, I mean, NATO got through that summit without a big blow up. But I think, 3 or 4 days later, the general view is that's been a terrible failure of the alliance. There was only one item on the agenda, which was to placate this ridiculous man. And nevertheless, he's the elected leader of the United States, and there it is. And NATO has failed in most of its other responsibilities, not just to Ukraine, but to its own defense. And it will have to address all the issues that it wouldn't address last week, because the name of the game was to keep him in the meeting, keep him in the room. And 32 heads of state traveled into The Hague to spend 2.5 hours in one meeting, where they managed to keep him sitting down for 2.5 hours before he left and did all of his press conference stuff. That was the sum total of a major NATO meeting. That says something. So what is going on in the Atlantic relationship? That's the first, big issue that we look at, the things that confuse us. Well, let's look at what are the underlying issues. The underlying issues are that the Western world as a concept is gone. It's not to say that Western countries are not quite important and powerful, but the idea of a collective Western world that somehow set the trends, that created the structures and the sort of predictability of world politics, that's been obviously under pressure for some time, but it's now gone. Not just because of Donald Trump, but it's been going, as I'll explain in a while, it's been going for some time. Certainly for the last 20, 25 years, and it's now effectively gone, which is to say that the rest of the world, the non-Western world, doesn't now take the Western world as the model. doesn't regard the Western world as somehow leading in political or in economic terms. And the transatlantic relationship is now in a very different state. That's the first obvious thing that's happened. The Western world has changed. International law, I don't know why that keeps changing, but the thing has taken control of itself. International law effectively is not now a universal principle, even though it was more honoured in the breach than the observance. I've been at conferences with a lot of very eminent lawyers who said that, look, it's gone. International law is gone. There's law still exists in certain areas, like in maritime law, in trade law. There are certain areas, certain functions in which law is important, and certain areas, say within Europe, where law still matters. International law is still quite powerful, but in the rest of the world, it isn't. And that's very different to 20 odd years ago. We thought international law was growing, even though it was obviously, much ignored. It nevertheless established a principle, but that principle has been weakening all the time. So the idea of a Western world based on an international legal framework that the Western world created, of course, over a couple of 100 years or 150 years, that's actually more or less gone. And the two key dates in this disappearance are 2008 and 2014. In 2008, the economic crisis did tremendous damage to not just to the economies of the West, but also to the reputation of the West, because before 2008, it was always sort of assumed that only the liberal democracies were genuinely prosperous. Well, that's no longer true. The liberal democracies are not the most prosperous countries in the world and don't look as if they will become, obviously, retain their position as the most prosperous in the world. By and large, the autocracies are growing more prosperous all the time. And 2008 was a massive turning point in the expectations of the rest of the world in what they thought the Western world provided. And the other big date was 2014. In 2013, the Western world, rightly or wrongly, had established red lines over the use of chemical weapons in Syria and then backed away from them, didn't do anything about them. And as a result of that failure in 2013, first of all, if you're going to establish red lines, you better mean it. And we established red lines and then didn't mean it. And as a result of that, chemical weapons were used in Syria more than 200 times after 2013. But the bigger issue was that that poor piece of policy, whether you agreed with it or not at the time, was a disaster in terms of the view the rest of the world took of Western resolution, if you like. I mean, don't try and sound resolute if you don't mean it. And in 2014, Putin's first invasion of Ukraine took place, first in Crimea and then in Donbass in two phases between the sort of spring and the late summer of that year. And the sense was, we can do this, we can get away with it. And what was happening in Afghanistan all added to that sense that the Western world talks a good game, but won't stand up for itself. It won't do what it says it's going to do. You can push them. 2014 was also the year in which Islamic State, as it were, rode to create the caliphate in the Middle East, and that's created another destabilizing factor, which is still working its way through both the Middle East and to a large degree in North Africa. So the Western world, that the underlying reality of the catastrophe wheel is not so much Trump and the NATO summit and the rows. Those certainly exist. They get the headlines. What's going on underneath that is the end of the Western world as it were, predominant idea in the economy and the political structure and the legal structures of global politics. All right, wrong way. And that has been effectively replaced by this sort of thing. You see this all the time. We look at Europe. We look at how close Europe is to the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East. They're on the eastern edge of the Black Sea, Georgia. I was there only last week or just 10 days ago. Quite sobering, really, quite depressing. They're just waiting for the Russians to move in. And the government there is becoming ever more authoritarian. It's squeezing out the opposition, saying that this is what will prevent the Russians from moving in, but they're doing exactly what Moscow wants. I went up Rustaveli Avenue, where all the protests are taking place on a nightly basis, determined not to get myself arrested, and managed not to. But it's quite an interesting area. And then at the bottom of that map of Europe, there across the Sahel, in Mali, in Niger, in Chad, in Sudan, coups, military coups, authoritarianism, the use of mercenaries, and the people who suffer, of course, are the ordinary people who are whose state gets ever more desperate. The Middle East, we're in the middle of all of that. The Ukraine crisis on bottom right, and then on the left, bottom left there, Taiwan and East Asia. Those two red lines are interesting. The first red line, the left-hand one, is what the Chinese call the first island chain. And within that line, they say everything belongs to them, basically, that all of the waters and all of those islands, and Taiwan in particular, of course, is their territory. And they are asserting themselves with military power, and they're making it clear they'll fight for any of those territories if the world challenges them. And we're getting very close to that. The second island chain, that right-hand line, is the area that they regard as an area where they want predominant influence, where they want to make sure that the United States or Western powers don't feel that they've got freedom of the seas to operate in those areas, or if they do, they only do it with the permission of the Chinese. So there's a great deal of regional chaos everywhere you look in the world, and I've just put these maps up as illustrative. And what's going on underneath that? What's the longer term trend? Well, the longer term trend, what's driving the catastrophe wheel around, is what the Whitehall calls extreme multipolarity. It's not just that power is shifting from, if you like, the Europeans to the Asian countries. It's not just that. It is that the world is becoming much more multipolar. We had a bipolar world during the Cold War, effectively, Soviet Union and America. And then for a while, for 20 odd years, a unipolar world where the United States was the one unchallenged superpower of world politics. That's disappeared now. And we are in a multipolar world in which there are several poles. And that will be just as big a problem in the long run for the Russians and the Chinese as it now is for us. And within that multipolar world, we're looking at the four big powers, the four big players. The big ones are the United States, China, Russia, and India. And they're all big powers, great powers, for their own different reasons. I mean, Russia has got an economy which is staggering, but it's a big power for other reasons and in other ways. India is the most populous state in the world, and that is finding it difficult to turn that into power, but it will. And China has got lots and lots of problems looking to the future, but it undoubtedly feels that it's embarked on the Asian century. And the United States is a major power, in whichever way it goes. And the point about these four powers is that 3 out of the 4 are all revisionist powers. Russia, China, and now America are all trying to change the rules of the game. They want to change the system. And the Russians are also a rogue state, and maybe under Trump, so is the United States. And what we mean by rogue state is a state that interferes in the elections of other countries, that tries to undermine what other countries are doing, is prepared to behave in a sort of mafia way. They all do it, of course. All 4 of them do a certain amount of that. All 4 of them send assassins around the world to try to kill their enemies. And the Russians do it more than anyone else. There is a sense in which America may be moving in that direction. So 3 out of the 4 states are revisionist states. One of them is definitely a rogue state, and possibly under Trump, the United States is behaving in a rogue state way. And I'll explain a bit more what I mean about that in a moment. So that's the sort of the thing that's behind this regional chaos that we seem to see. And just as an example, I mean, here is economic power shifts towards autocratic rule. If you look at the end of the Cold War there in 1992, the liberal democracies that we would understand as proper democracies, in our view, made up 60% of global wealth, global GDP. Now it's about 40%. And the others are making up 60%. And the interesting ones there are the light blue and the light pink, because the light blue represent those democracies that they are democratic. Power can change hands, but it gets more and more difficult, as in Turkey, as in Hungary, as in Slovakia, say, because the government in power fixes it, and they fix elections. It's not that they can't lose, but it gets harder and harder for the opposition to win in any fair way. And then electoral autocracy are those countries that pretend that they are democratic, but actually they're not. So Venezuela would be one case, Russia would be another case. And there's the closed autocracies, those countries which are simply under military rule, and that's an end to it. But it's the light blue and the light pink which are interesting because, believe me, the current trend in world politics is not so much to arrest the opposition and throw them into jail and they're never seen again, as happened in Syria over so many years. What the autocrats have learned is a kind of playbook where they make it difficult, increasingly difficult for people to oppose them. They make it very costly. So it costs you your job. It costs your family access to welfare. It costs you, as it were, the participation in all the things in your community. They just increase the cost of opposition so that people eventually decide they better live with it. And there's a real playbook developing all over the world. You don't need to torture people to control the government for 50 or 60 years. You simply have to raise the cost of opposition, which means that what we take for granted in liberal democracies, really is, we're becoming something of an endangered species. And the third big element, which we see in our newspapers, is the right wing, if you like, or the nationalists, the ultra-nationalists. And I just give a couple of examples here. Look at the map of Europe. The darker picture, the darker shading is where there are nationalist and ultra-right-wing parties on the rise. They come and go, and there are setbacks, of course. But at the moment, that is quite strong. The map of the United States shows Republican and Democrats. Republicans, remember, in the red, Democrats in the blue. And this is where I come back to this struggle for the soul of America. That Republican heartland is taken over by what's now being characterized as a sort of Christian national imperialism. It's Christian nationalism with an imperialist flavor, which is very 19th century-ish. And it's also a sort of Christian Zionism. And that goes back to John Adams, the second president, who talked about Christian Zionism. That's part of in the Bible Belt in the United States. This sense from the fundamentalist Christians that they say that, look, the second coming won't happen, according to the Bible. The second coming won't happen until the Jews are restored to Judea, so Judea and Samaria, which to you and me is the occupied territories. And so there's a great sort of wellspring of commitment on the part of right-wing Republicans, MAGA Republicans, to saying that, look, Israel has got to have all the territory it needs, that it thinks it wants. Then the Jews will be restored to Judea, and only then can we look forward to the second coming in our own world. Now, that may sound pretty fanciful to us worldly secularists in Europe, but believe me, it plays to the MAGA base in Republican circles. And the United States is uniquely polarized. And the alt-right, the reason I put that there is not really to talk so much about the alt-right, but it's the other bit, the age of rage, because that's what's driving a lot of this pushback is the age of rage. What are they raging about? This, migration. And that look at migration, again, you don't need to look too heavily at the map. Areas of dark blue, which is where there's a lot of migration in percentage terms. You see Australia is dark blue, Canada is dark blue. That's because they're big territories with quite small populations. So a relatively small input of people puts them into the dark blue. But look at the difference between the blue and the pink. That's the important thing. The fact is that global migration is quite strong and will continue. It's a structural trend. And in numerical terms, it's not great. It's about 3% of the global population. But of course, throughout world history, it was way less than 1%. Now it's about 3%, which doesn't sound a lot. But of course, it's 360, 400 million people over a 20-year period, over a generation. And that's, if those 360, 400 million people, that averages out at, say, 18 or 20 million people every year, then for some countries, that represents more than they can feel that they can handle. But this trend of migration from the poorer to the richer countries is structural. It's not likely to change. And that's what's pushing this sense of fear, because it's a sense that the people are trying to hold on to their way of life. It's a threat to their way of life. It creates that fear, and that fear is easily manipulable. Well, what is at root? I think we're all fairly well aware of that. What is behind that? Behind that is the struggle against globalization. It's a sort of kickback against globalization. I mean, have a look at this chart. I mean, this is a chart, a growth of global exports back to 1800. And you see that global exports in terms of compared to anything else was really not great until the 1950s. And then it shoots up. And that's really driving globalization. Trade is an immense driver of globalization and all the things it brings with it. And look at the left-hand axis there. It's not hundreds we're dealing with, it's thousands. So we're talking about 5,000% increase in a lifetime from 1950, my lifetime, through to where we are now. 5,000% increase, which is why you can get things on Amazon, you can get things from all over the world, and why we're all living in this globalized age. Globalization didn't really begin until the late 1980s. And that first wave of globalization went literally from about 1988 to 2008. And in 2008, it came to something of a shuddering halt. And that globalization, look, this is again, you don't need to worry about the two different, the dotted line and the trend line there. But this is real GDP per capita within the European Union. And it just shows the increase in wealth between 1990, 88, 90, to 2018, 2020, which is the real GDP capita per growth went from literally 22,000 euros to 32,000 euros. So people were getting richer, no doubt about it, through globalization. But this is the one that gives you the anger that is behind the anger directed at migration. And this is often known as the elephant chart. And it shows global income growth right through from 88 to 2008. It's not that people on the downward trend there are getting poorer. They're not. It's the rate of growth of their incomes. But there you are, the very poorest on the bottom left, they're locked out of growth altogether. The rising incomes are all in the emerging economies of Asia. And the decline is developed world middle class people whose incomes have not grown at all in this period. And so their real incomes have remained relatively static. They're not poor by any stretch, but their incomes are not growing while there's a booming global elite. The Jeff Bezos having his wedding, the Elon Musk, the footballers, the pop stars, everybody can see them, conspicuous wealth in a time when other people, most ordinary people who are quite prosperous, their income isn't growing. And it's that decline in developed world middle class incomes which has created this real sense of anger that they are somehow not benefiting from globalization, whilst migration and the threat to their lifestyle is worrying them. It makes them really easy to manipulate politically. And that's not going to get much different. Let me just go back on that. Because look at growth projections, the global economy. And that's more or less the picture. If you look on the right there, the green, the emerging markets and the developing economies are growing about twice as fast as the advanced economies, those in the middle. The global economy is somewhere in between, as you would expect. Those high figures for 2022, incidentally, were the kickback after COVID, because the growth immediately shot up because COVID had taken it down. But the advanced economies now are looking at growth at around 2% would be good. That's about as high as most of them are going to get. Whereas the emerging market economies, they're growing at twice that speed, and some of them are growing at 6 and 7%. And that's a historical reality. I think you may have seen this one before in previous presentations, but it's quite important. I mean, this is a chart showing shares of global GDP from the year 1500, when we were in the middle of the Tudor age, say, or the beginning of the Tudor age, down to 2008, which is this landmark date, in my view. And the red trend line I've put on, that's for Asia. That's the whole of Asia. And the yellow trend line is the China bit. So you can see there that China is only about half the story. It was half the story in the year 1500. It's still only about half the story. But the story, the basic story, is that in 1500, the Asian economies made up over 60% of global GDP. And there, that great big sort of salient there, that's the colonial age, 1913, 1950, 1973, and it's coming back. The trend is back to where it was 500 years ago. And again, China's about half the picture. The rest of Asia, which is India, Southeast Asia, is the rest of the picture. And so we've known this, for a generation. We can see this happening. This is the structural trend. So the Asian economies will be more dominant in terms of their share of global GDP for the foreseeable historical future, for certainly the rest of the century. It's not to say that they won't be disrupted by certain things, but that's the way it will be. And the final point I would make is that what about the common humanity issues? What about all the challenges? And I use this slide just as an example of the environmentalism. We all know that there is an environmental crisis. Nobody would seriously question that, except some in the United States. But scientifically, I don't think there's any doubt about it. And we know that the only way to address this is by collective action. And it's not just that. I use this as one example. I could spend the whole hour talking about all the common humanity challenges that we face. But here's another one. We go from the misery created by climate change to the poorest countries in the world, like in Sudan or in the Sahel, through to space. And that's a representation of low Earth orbit. There's 10,000 working satellites, plus a great deal of junk, up to 500,000 pieces of junk circulating in low Earth orbit, which is the Earth orbit that's most useful for things on Earth. About 10,000 satellites presently active in low Earth orbit. But of course, it's now become commercial. I mean, Elon Musk's Starlink, which is a very good thing in technical terms and is the market leader, they're putting 40,000 satellites into low Earth orbit. Other organizations are doing the same. They're all looking at multiple thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit to do all sorts of different things. And there is no regulation on it. What we used to have as space law is now irrelevant. And because the situation on Earth is now so politically chaotic, there is almost no chance of a common approach to the new politics of space. And so while on the one hand we deal with environment and we look at environment and we look at global inequality, which creates absolute misery for those who are poor, on the other end of the scale, we have no way of regulating, it seems, the increase in the use of low Earth orbit and space assets. And warfare is coming to space. Already now, the major powers are trying out their ASAT weapons, anti-satellite weapons, so they can blind each other in space as and when they start to fight on Earth. So it all seems pretty depressing. Here we are. I love this image. I just think it's so evocative, really. It reminds me of John of Gaunt in Richard II. He when he talks in his very sentimentalized way, Shakespeare talks in a very sentimentalized way. He calls this England, he said, this precious stone set in a silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. Well, that was the way he put it. But I mean, in terms of the Britain being a moat, having a moat around it, that was right for over 2,000 years, until certainly the Second World War, also really up to the end of the Cold War. We had a moat. But now, of course, it's almost completely irrelevant in the situation in which we find ourselves in. And so as we look at our future with that of our partners in Europe, and look how many partners we have in Europe, look how close our partnerships are in Europe, as well as the hostility we feel from further away in Russia. It's important that we understand the problem. We've got to understand it, not just the things that hit our headlines day after day, but to try to understand the underlying trends, the end of the Western world as a concept, the end of a global economic status quo, a change into a great power multilateralism, a series of revolts against globalization. Those are things we need to understand to see what matters. And we're undoubtedly facing some really tough times. All of us in Western Europe are facing tough times, and we certainly can't rely on the United States as to leading the defense of the democracies. They've given up on democracy for the time being, certainly internationally and probably within their own country for some time. And so we have to decide in Britain what matters to us most. What do we want to hold on to? What are the crown jewels for us that we really want to hold on to? We have to be very adaptive. We're going to have to be clever, and we're going to have to be brave in all sorts of ways. And in a way, we've had it good for so long, and I think we've got to realize that previous generations of our communities dealt with the turn of the catastrophe wheel in their own different ways. We're the ones where the catastrophe wheel has only now just really turned after 50 or 60 years. And so it's our turn now. They dealt with it in their own ways, in their own catastrophe wheels. Now our catastrophe wheel has turned. So we've got to deal with it, firstly, by understanding it as best we can. Secondly, by deciding what's most important to us. And thirdly, by being really clear how we hold on to that, how we hold on to what's important to us, mainly through relying and relating to each other. which I know in Hexham you do very well. So thank you very much.
First question is from David. What's your current view of the threat to the Suwalki Gap, a short border between Lithuania and Poland?
Oh, the Suwalki Gap. Can I just talk? Can I just talk?
Yeah.
Oh, the Suwalki Gap. Oh, yeah, is this famous gap. It's about 60 kilometers long, 60, 70 kilometers long between Lithuania and Belarus. And it's a constant issue for NATO. Is that the idea is that in a war with Russia and Belarus, would Russian forces push through the Suwalki Gap towards Kaliningrad, which is this enclave of Russia in Lithuania. That might have been possible in the past, but it would be a very dangerous thing for any Russian forces to try to do now that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, because the Baltic Sea now more or less belongs to NATO. It's the Russians who find themselves more on the strategic back foot there, because, I mean, the Finns are really serious. They're a serious military player. So is Sweden. But Finland is a really serious military player when they put their minds to it. And they look as if they're putting their minds to it now. So I think, in a way, the Suwalki Gap is not now a sort of a form of weakness. The fear was that the three Baltic states couldn't be defended if they were taken over, or some part of them was taken over, that the Allies were too far away and they could be cut off from the Baltics. But it is now the case that the Baltics could be defended really pretty well from Finland and Sweden across the southern Baltic Sea. So I don't get too excited about the Suwalki Gap. And if I was a general staff member of Russia, I would worry about it now. I wouldn't see it as an opportunity. I'd see it as a problem that will, come any hostilities, we lose our enclave in Kaliningrad. That would be the answer.
And there was a supplementary question: why have we not triggered Article 4 over Trump's threat to Greenland and/or Canada? I'm not sure which Article 4 that is.
Yeah, well, no, you're right, and then the NATO treaty. Article 5 is the common defence article, but Article 4 is the fact that we will act in concert as a group of allies, and so on. It's different things. The Canada issue doesn't really come into Article 4, but the idea of a NATO ally, actually taking over by force or coercion another territory of a NATO member is unthinkable. And to be honest, if it happened, it would kill NATO. I think it would kill it. It would certainly kill the transatlantic element of NATO, which you may say is going to die anyway. Certainly in very bad shape at the moment. And the Greenland thing, Trump is serious about Greenland. I mean, the Americans have often been serious about it. Twice in the 19th century, they raised the possibility of buying Greenland, because if you look at it on the map, you can see how strategically important it is. And in 1947, Truman raised the issue again. Is there some way we can do a deal and take over Greenland? Because during the Second World War, America occupied Greenland, actually walked in and occupied it with Allied agreement, because Denmark was occupied by the Germans. They didn't want any German forces turning up in Greenland. And so they occupied it. And when they withdrew, and apart from the Thule base, as it is, Pichufik as it's now called, they just left it like that. But there is a perfectly good strategic reason for the Americans to have troops in Greenland. But the point about everything that they want, they can have with the present arrangement. The present arrangement gives them ability to do everything they say they want to do, including exploitation of the minerals. The reason that Trump is interested in Greenland is because he wants his statue on Mount Rushmore, right? As well as a Nobel Peace Prize, he wants to be the fifth president on Mount Rushmore, because he wants to be the president who added to the territory of the United States. 40% of the territory of the US was bought. It was purchased. The Louisiana Purchase, Florida, some of California, and Alaska. So from his point of view, as a business real estate man, he said, I want to buy Greenland. And the president, will have added another, whatever it is, 15% to America's territory, and for that he gets to go onto Mount Rushmore. So that's his motive. Is nothing really to do with a good deal, which he's already got for Greenland. It is that he physically wants that bit of the map to be coloured in the same colour as the United States. And
there's a little follow-up question: does that mean Greenland is as strategic to the US as Alaska is to Putin?
Yes, in a way. It's more important than Alaska, because Greenland is deep up into the Arctic Circle, and so as the as global warming opens up the famous Northwest Passage for the first time in human history, as far as we know, then the North Atlantic and that Northwest Passage between Asia and the North Atlantic and Europe is going to become extremely critical in the next 50 to 100 years, and maybe for several hundred years after that. And Greenland, you've only got, again, look at the map, is really, really important. So it's resources, it's defence, and it's economic control or economic influence over what will be one of the most important seaborne passages in global history.
Okay. That kind of puts in context why he's so interested.
Yeah, he's right to be interested.
Yeah.
That's the point. But you can, Mr. President, you can pursue your interest by as things are. You don't need to change anything.
Exactly.
Just get on with it. Just do it. The Greenlanders have agreed. The Danes have agreed in 1947. Just do it instead of making a fuss about wanting this bit of land coloured in your colour.
Hugh asks, just moving on, thanks for that, Michael. Does the UK have any soft power from our experience to influence a sensible global way forward?
Yes, we do. Power? Yeah, no, we still have good soft power. We're not number 1 or 2 as we used to be, but we're number 5 or 6 by most standards now. And I did a book with my great colleague Helen Ramskar in 2021 called Britain's Persuaders, Soft Power in a Hard World. And we looked at all of the elements of British soft power, which are very considerable. And it's not just the BBC and the World Service and the British Council. It is those things, but it's lots of other things as well. Regulators, the entertainment, TV, film. I mean, there's so many ways in which Britain is taken seriously. I mean, in central London, I'm as I say, I hang around Whitehall a lot. And if when you go there, you'll see there's so many phone boxes all the way around that corner by Westminster. There's about 8 or 9 of them within a space of about 200 meters. And there are queues every day of the week, literally all year round, for people to have their photograph taken outside a red telephone box. Right. And so they've had to put extra boxes there to cope with the queues of people wanting to stand in the box to have a selfie. And that goes on all year round. Why is that? Because the British brand in films is central London red telephone boxes. And here we are in 2025. That's still a very active little symbol of Britain. So although people criticise Britain a lot, there's still an awful lot about Britain that they want. The important thing for us in the situation that we're in is that we need to present ourselves as a consistent, mature, serious-minded power. We used to have this reputation as a country where things got done. We weren't the biggest in the world by any means, but we're a country where things worked, things got done. We were reassuringly conservative. Conservative in a social sense, and yet we had this great sort of wellspring of real inventiveness. We were scientifically inventive, we were creative, artistically created, and yet that was within a kind of general sense of conservatism. And the thing that matters in soft power, there's only 3 things really that make a country really popular in world politics. The 3 things with people around the world. Number 1 is it law abiding? Does the law matter in that country? And secondly, is it prosperous? And thirdly, is there opportunity? Is it a country of opportunity? And we scored so highly on those things. We were very law-abiding, we were prosperous, and yes, there was lots of opportunity in Britain. Not the sort of crazy opportunities of California, or the crazy opportunities of the oil market in Kazakhstan, but nevertheless, for ordinary people, Britain was a land where you could get some opportunity, and where Brits themselves felt they had opportunity. And that's all been eroded. And we've got to get back to that. Law abiding, so we mean it when we say we live by the law and we respect our law and we don't criticise our judges and we don't abuse our judges and so on, as has happened and happens all the time in the United States. So yes, we're law abiding. Yes, we're prosperous. We want to get back onto that road, of course, if we can. And of course, we want to unleash the sense of opportunity, because we have so much to offer in the ways our society works and so many things are developed in Britain. I mean, graphene, it was a very good example. Graphene was developed by 2 Nobel Science Prize winners at the University of Manchester. And graphene is in everything, from modern computing down to sports shoes. And when graphene was developed, but invented by these 2 guys in the 1980s, we ended up, about 10 years later, we had 50 patents out on it, 50. and China had about 5,000, and the Americans had about 20,000 patents on graphene. So they were developing it. We invented it and we didn't develop it. And the Chinese and the Americans, they saw it, they took it, they invented it. I mean, that happens over and over and over again. The inventiveness is there, but we don't have the investment or the investment climate to really develop it. And sadly, it's getting worse, not better in that respect, or has done in the last 5 or 8 years.
Thank you. So changing the subject a bit, the questions are about, I was trying to see if I could group them, but they're all different. Yeah. So Penny's asking what the options are if NATO fails to keep Daddy in the room. So if they can.
I think that's what's going to happen, to be honest. NATO, I wouldn't say NATO's finished, but NATO as we know it is finished. I think the transatlantic element will fade. I mean, I think the United States, even after Trump, whatever happens, in 2028, will be much more skeptical about backing its allies. The NATO in Europe, 32 nations now, at least 32 nations in total, so 30 of them 29 actually, got Iceland in Europe. But NATO's more than twice the size it used to be. And at more than twice the size, it's only half as powerful because it's so many nations and most of them don't really bring anything other than commitments. Most of them don't actually contribute very much, except Finland and Sweden were the two most important new members. But when you look at North Macedonia and Montenegro, the military power of Montenegro, all these countries in Southern Europe, they bring more responsibilities. They increase the boundaries of NATO that NATO's got to defend, but they don't really contribute very much. And so what I think is happening is that we're going to end up with, put it crudely, a northern NATO and a southern NATO. And the northern NATO will be, this is where Britain sees itself as taking something of a lead, not because it wants to, but because it will have to. But Britain and then Germany and Poland, those are the two big countries. Those are the two big contributors to NATO now, Germany and Poland. So Britain, Germany, Poland, the Scandinavian states, the tiny Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark, the Netherlands. France is a big issue because France is both north and south. It's got an Atlantic coast and a Mediterranean coast, and French attitudes to NATO have always been a bit iffy. So France is, maybe, maybe not. But you'll end up with that northern core of NATO, which will be quite militarily powerful. And then you have a southern group of states who are bending towards Russia already. Some of them just see that NATO won't help them. They've given up on the United States, and they're living with the realities. And so you got Erdogan of Turkey, you got Orban of Hungary, Fico of Slovakia, and they basically are Russian. Well, Fico particularly and Orban are Russian clients. They won't do anything that they think Putin will disapprove of, and they certainly, I don't know if they actually take instructions from Moscow, but they certainly bend towards what Moscow wants. And so NATO, I think, will become a sort of southern group who will not be very effective and won't really defend themselves against Russian incursion or Russian influence, and a northern group who will become more fierce about both defending themselves and resisting Russian incursions into their elections and their social status, their social media and so on. So NATO, I think, is changing, and it won't be this great transatlantic alliance that it has been for 70 odd years. And it's been the greatest alliance the world has ever seen. And it's been incredibly successful, but it's now facing real, not collapse, but evolution into something really quite different.
Yeah, thank you. Well, a couple of questions now that are a similar subject around the defence budget. So is a recent increase in the defence budget a waste of time? And is it wise to be reducing foreign aid at the same time as increasing defence?
Yeah, the foreign aid, I think that was a very poor decision to reduce foreign aid in order to make up the 6 billion that they wanted to put into defence. The reason for that was that at the time when they increased defence by that 6 billion to bring it up to the 2.2%, 2.3% of GDP that we now have, one is the government wanted to show that for every new spending commitment there would be within the envelope. So they said, look, we're taking it from here and putting it there. And that was partly for domestic reasons, but it was also to show the Americans that we are prepared to cut our foreign aid. This is when Trump had just, literally slashed the US foreign aid budget, which has caused misery around the world in lots of ways. And it was a bit of Me Tooism. Say, look, we can do that as well. That was so disreputable in my view, because the fact is the amount of money they're talking about in the scheme of defence spending for the next few years was pretty small. And cutting foreign aid is cutting one of those big areas of soft power.
Mm.
It's not just the human misery that cutting that aid creates, but it's also the sense that the United Kingdom has given up on other societies in the world, that we
Yeah,
don't care enough
exactly.
about them. And so
Yeah.
it was for the sake of a certain amount of symbolism and domestic commitment to not raising expenditure overall. I
Mm.
think we made a very poor decision. And remember that the foreign aid that is left, the genuine foreign aid, is very small. Most of the foreign aid budget gets spent in Britain,
Mm.
as does most of the American foreign aid budget. It's spent on British groups doing things or on
Yeah.
hotels for asylum seekers. I mean, less and less of the foreign aid actually ends up being spent in South Sudan or anywhere else. So, the foreign aid has needed to be reformed for years. We've needed to
Mm.
do that for years. But, I mean, reforming it by slashing it is not a clever idea, in my view.
Thank you. And there's a question when you touched on at the end about the other issues going on affecting the globe. The question is,
Yeah.
how can we both defend against disruptors like Russia and China, etc., and at the same time work with them on issues, those global issues on
Yeah, really good point. That's a really clever point. That it's in a way it goes back to a more sophisticated version of containment, which we had during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, we said, look, we will oppose you militarily if we think that you're going to try and expand. Whether they were or not is a different question. But we will oppose you in this way. But if we can talk to you about anything of common interest, of course we will. And we didn't always stick to that. I mean, but Britain was better at that than the United States, that used to go off in a huff all the time in the Cold War. And Britain was that country that kept open business-like relationships. And we
Mm.
did it, through Macmillan. We did it through Wilson and Callaghan were quite good at that. Mrs. Thatcher turned out to be pretty good at it, actually, even though she despised the Russians in so many ways, or the Soviets. But then she said, look, we've got to talk to them. And in 1985, she opened up dialogue, which the Americans weren't so happy about at the time. And she was right to do that. So we've always been quite good at that. And I think that's the new thing, to say, look, we are not going to bow down in front of your bullying. We're not taking your nuclear threats very seriously. We're not going to be frightened by it. And we are going to stand for what we want to defend, both in physical territory and defend our institutions against the way we know you meddle in them, and your cyber attacks and your cutting of cables and your pipeline sabotage. And they do it all the time. And again, I know enough about what goes on in Whitehall to know this is a daily battle which we are now fighting against cyber, against cable cutting and pipeline sabotage. It goes on every day of the week, right? Literally. And so we're fighting those battles. We've got to make it really clear to the Russians that we're going to oppose this and stop it. But if we can talk to you about something that you care about, I mean, if you
Mm.
if you're prepared to talk about global warming, of course we want to talk about global warming. Of course we do with China, and that's not inconsistent. It's back to what we're quite good at in Britain, or traditionally been quite good at, being a responsible power, being clear to our adversaries to say, look, we are adversaries. We don't pretend we like you or we know that you don't like us. But the fact is, this is our position, and we are happy to explore ways of mitigating our hostility and of dealing with common problems. And it's a business-like, hard-nosed attitude, and we used to be respected for it. Less so in recent years for all sorts of reasons, but we could get back to that.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe it is the trade part that's part of we still want to talk to people, don't we, about trade?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, there's a big argument going on throughout Whitehall now, particularly in Parliament, about, well, trade with Saudi Arabia. We think about the Khashoggi murder. Mohammed bin Salman clearly ordered Khashoggi to be murdered and chopped up. And the fact is, but Mohammed bin Salman's a young man. He's going to be there for the next 30 years. And
Mm.
trade with Saudi Arabia is quite important. So what are we going to do? And there is this sense of, well, you've got to get the balance. We've got to deal with countries that we don't like and leaders that we don't like. And if we make a fuss about Khashoggi, then they'll be less inclined to do it again. So it is worth
Mm.
making a fuss.
Yeah.
And it is hypocritical in one sense. We make a terrible fuss and then we trade with
Yeah.
them. But at least they know next time Mohammed bin Salman thinks about getting somebody assassinated, someone will say, boss, look, don't do this. Look what happened over Khashoggi. Let's do this in a different way. There's a reason for making a fuss about something, to
Mm.
show that power, that it's not cost free to behave in a criminal way, to behave in a really bad way like that. So although it's hypocritical, there is a sort of logic to it as well. And, we're in a position where We can't just impose our morality on everyone else. The thing is that we've just got to hold our morality to our own society. We've got to do it ourselves and represent it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Going back to soft power. Soft power is not what you do; it's what you are. What gives you soft power is not what you do in the world. That's power. But soft power it's an expression of what you are as a society, what you represent, what you live, and that gives you soft power.
There's a question around the media that I think feeds into this about, is the media serving us well? And the example is that we haven't heard much about or anything about Georgia and the Russian threat, but loads about Farage and Israel. But I'm thinking as well about the image it gives out about our country.
Yeah, I mean, I care a lot about Georgia. That's partly why I was there a couple of weeks ago. Um, our media is not nearly as good as it thinks it is. I mean, our media tells itself that there's a robustness about our popular media, the red tops, but they're not robust. They're not very good, and our quality media is not nearly as quality as it thinks it is.
Mm.
And I work now at Sky News I'm on contract to Sky, and I see the mechanics of it more clearly than I used to, in a way. And it's not that they do care about what they write and what they put on. There is a forensic group. I see lots of things and I say, can we use this? And they say, oh, got to check it out first. And it might be another 6 hours before we can use it because they check it out. They take a lot of trouble to check things out. But the agenda is driven by what's popular today. So no, they don't want to deal with Georgia until somebody gets killed, until there's something visual to look at. And then they'll do a Georgia story. And of course, and I'd say this quite literally, I can be waiting to do something on Ukraine or on Gaza, and quite honestly, me and the other people who are involved in it, we've been sitting around waiting for two Sky correspondents on the pavement, chatting away inconsequentially for 10 minutes, because Prince Harry is going to come out of a door and get into a car. And because Sky is, if it's live, it's on Sky. They have to get it. They mustn't miss it. And so, for Prince Harry to appear for 15 seconds, come out of a doorway, get into a car, two people are there chatting away, and the rest of us have got stories to put onto screen. We can't get on, and that's just the way of it. That's the nature of it.
I've got one question that was asked earlier, but I was saving it to last. So this is the last one: does your crystal ball say anything about how the Ukraine-Russian war is going to develop?
Ukraine, yeah. Well, it will carry on. I think the Americans will not completely pull the plug on Ukraine. I think they'll continue with a certain amount of intelligence sharing. The Europeans will try to help Ukraine with more material and ammunition. The Ukrainians seem determined to fight on. It's up to them, of course. I mean, they're the ones doing the fighting. They will fight on, and there may or may not be a ceasefire this year. I suspect not. And we'll see what happens to Russia in spring of 2025. But this war will continue for some time before it reaches a ceasefire. It might be the autumn of this year, or it might be sometime next year, a ceasefire. But the ceasefire will be temporary, it'll be unstable, because Putin and the Russian state, the Russian elite is absolutely determined to take over Ukraine at some point. I mean, whether it's this year, 2 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, whatever, they will have not given up on that. So the antagonism between Russia and Ukraine is generational. So that will go on for 40, 60 years, whatever, for the rest of this century, probably. And we, in the West, we've got to try to find some way, if there's a ceasefire, somehow stabilizing that so that it doesn't just break out again. I mean, to a ceasefire that somehow won't be a peace process, but it will become an established fact in which people stop having to die and we can all get on with something else. And the 80% of Ukraine, which is not occupied by the Russians, and preferably even less than that, can get on with its life. And then, that's not very satisfactory, but it's better than continuing war.
Thank you very much, Michael. There's so much in what you've been talking about today. I'll definitely have to listen to the recording to get some more out of it, because there's such great content. And thanks again for taking time out of your Saturday to be part of our series.
Thanks, Faye. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
You're very welcome. So this is the last of our online, but we have one more panel discussion, in-person one in Hexham, if you're local to Hexham. That's on the 19th of July, and we'll be on the subject of migration. So that's it for today. If anybody wants to make a donation towards our IT and room costs, then you can reply to the email you get or send a message through our website. And thanks to everyone that joined us live today as well. And we'll be sharing the recording so other people can benefit from Michael's knowledge and insider information. So thanks again, everybody, and see you next series. Take care. Bye.